The following program is brought to you by Caltech.
Good evening. I'm Jonathan Katz. I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. I'm the division chair for the Humanities and Social Sciences. But for those of you who are regulars at the Watson Lectures know, my first task is to tell you what the next talk is going to be. And that's going to be by John Eiler, who's the Robert P. Sharp Professor of Geology and Professor of Geochemistry. And he's going to be talking on the journeying to Earth's past in the isotope time machine. And that's going to be on February 29th, same time. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Liat Yariv. Liat Yariv is a professor of economics here at Caltech. She was an undergraduate in mathematics and physics at Tel Aviv and stayed on to get her master's and actually continued on to get her in the PhD program in mathematics before deciding that to change gears and to go to get a PhD in economics at Harvard. She then was a postdoc at Yale and then was nearby as a junior faculty member, assistant professor at UCLA. And we successfully recruited her to Caltech in 2005. Liat's a very broad economist doing work both in economic theory, laboratory experiments, which is something very important to Caltech, and also working with field data, which is what you're going to hear about tonight. She's a great speaker, and I'm sure you're all going to have a great evening. I'd like to thank you all for coming.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan, for the kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about child adoption in the US, but before I do that, let me give you some motivation for what started us out on the set of questions I'll be talking about. So the motivation for this project is the innocuous observation that matching markets play an important role in human life. So it's not only about children and adoptive parents, it's also about how friendships are formed, how we match with friends, how we match with our partners in the marriage market, how workers and employers match, how home buyers and real estate match, and so on and so forth. By and large, there are two ways in which matching occurs. So there are two classes of matching processes. One is decentralized. So for example, our own economics job market process is decentralized. When we look for new faculty, we sift through way too many applications that are sent to us. Then we invite some people over the year to give talks, and then we make offers. So it's sort of a messy process. The marriage market in Western countries is arguably decentralized. So there's no general system that kind of spits out a match for you. The adoption market that I'll talk about today is by and large decentralized as well. Now, as a contrast, there are many matching markets that are centralized. So one leading example is the one that some of you may have read about in the New York Times, which has to do with the matching of medical residents to hospitals. So the National Medical Residence Program matches many, many doctors every year. And the way it works is that doctors submit preferences over hospitals, hospitals submit preferences over doctors, and there is a centralized clearinghouse that spits out a match. US rabbis have been functioning in a similar fashion for many years. School choice matching kids and schools in certain cities in the US work through a centralized clearinghouse as well. So this leads to an ongoing set of policy questions. First of all, when do we want to intervene in markets? When do we want to create a centralized clearinghouse that will form the match? And the second thing is, how should we do this? If we decide that we want to actually introduce the centralized clearinghouse, which clearinghouse should we use? What mechanism should we choose? Now, just to give you a sense of how many lives this affects, the National Medical Residence Program had about 60,000 participants in 2011. Adopted kids account for about 2.5% of kids in the US. If you think about online dating, there are about 8.8 million users that are real users and way more people who have dabbled in it. And it's an industry that's worth over $1 billion. So the types of research questions that we deal with are of two sorts. The first one is the one that kind of relates directly to the types of policy questions that I just talked about. And that set of questions ask, how do different institutions fare in terms of outcomes? The second type of question is kind of takes a completely a reverse of engineering approach almost, and it says, suppose that I observe matching outcomes out there. What can I deduce about the participants' preferences or characteristics? So for example, if I observe marriage patterns, what can I deduce about the preferences over mate characteristics? Or today I'll talk a bit about what we can deduce from adoption outcomes on parents' preferences. So let me give you a brief history of models that underlie decentralized matching. And one of the classical models was introduced by Becker, who got the Nobel Prize in 1992, in a paper called The Theory of Marriage. And Becker thought of society as effectively a big cocktail party with rational-minded daters who are just thinking about the best person that they could get. So you enter society, and you just look for the most appealing partner you can conceivably get. The prediction for this is what we call positive assortative matching. So this is this idea that basically the most appealing or desirable partners, mates, will match with one another. Then the slightly less desirable individuals will match with one another, and so on and so forth. So people will sort themselves according to their desirability. As you can tell, us economists are a very romantic lot. There's a reason why I was slotted a day after Valentine's. But beyond that, it's not only a story of marriage markets, it also has to do with a lot of other matching markets, potentially. So that's how Becker thought about this. He thought that this may matter not only to the marriage market, but also to labor markets, where you think about matching of employers and employers, and real estate markets, where you're thinking about matching houses to buyers, and so on and so forth. So when we have such a beautiful theory, we want to test it with data. But the problem is that in general, if I just want to take this theory to data, it entails a bunch of hurdles. So for example, it's very hard to know what is higher quality in this market. So we know about certain things. We know that someone who's more beautiful, whatever that means, is maybe more appealing in the marriage market. We know that someone who really likes Caltech is more appealing in the marriage market, obviously, and so on and so forth, but we don't really know how to aggregate these things. We also don't know how these people interact. So ideally, we would want to know what they know about each other, how they interact with each other. But unfortunately, human subject committees do not like research agendas that involve stalking. So this is an obstacle for us. There is, however, some data from online dating. So it's not that nothing has been done. People have now used the new technologies to learn something about the marriage market and kind of translate this Becker's model directly. But the problem there is that we don't really know what an outcome is. Is it a date? Is it an exchange of a phone number? Should we really stalk these people and check when they get married, and so on? So this is why the adoption market is sort of special. So the adoption process is very exciting from a research perspective because we get very detailed information about the individuals that participate in it. So we see the entire process that they go through. Furthermore, there's a lot of commitment in this process. So when we see a match, it's essentially a commitment to adopt a child. So it's not like a date in the online dating process. So in that sense, it's a very exciting arena to look at these sorts of models. But it's also really exciting, to me at least, because it affects many lives. So some information for you about the adoption in the US. About 1.5 million kids in the US are adopted, and that accounts for about 2.5% of children in the US. A big fraction of these are domestically born, so about 87% are US born. Now, from a policy perspective, adoption is still in, I think, it's incubation in a way from the jurisdiction point of view. There's very light regulation, and it's mostly done state by state. And it's sort of important to think about regulation or policy in the context of adoption, because the alternative for having a child with a home is for the child to have kind of a temporary home. And there are currently about 500,000 children in foster care, and 32% are African American, which will tie to some of the stuff that I'll tell you later on, and 25% of them are available for adoption. There are two important policy debates that I'll touch upon today. One of them is the Hague Treaty. The Hague Treaty was ratified in the US in 2008, and it basically made it very difficult to adopt children from outside of the US and for international foreign parents to adopt children inside of the US. So it kind of made international adoption very difficult both ways. So that's one important policy question that's in the air these days. The other one is adoption by same-sex couples. So right now, there are about 3.1 million same-sex households in the US, but very low adoption rate among these. And in fact, several states in the US impose restrictions that are either explicit or implicit on adoption by same-sex couples. So these are the two policy questions that or debates that I'll touch upon a little bit toward the end of this talk. Okay, so our goals with my collaborators, Maria Giovanna Baccara, Ellen Collard-Wexler, and Leonardo Felli, were multifold. So first of all, we wanted to document adoptive parents' preferences over different children's attributes, in particular gender, race, and time to birth. And this is really important because it may affect investment in children more generally, as well as affecting how we should analyze alternative processes for adoption in the US. So if we're thinking really about different policies that affect the adoption process, we want to know the preferences of the individuals that participate in the process. It's information that's very difficult to get from biological children, because even though technology is evolving, most of the time when you have a biological child, you don't choose their gender or their race and so on. So it's very hard to see with biological children. It's also very difficult to get from census data. So census data is very cool for getting aggregate stuff. But suppose that I observed from the census that more girls are being adopted. There's kind of a basic supply and demand issue, because we don't know whether it's because parents really like girls more than they like boys, or it's because there are more girls that are available for adoption. So just looking at aggregates doesn't give us the type of information that we would want to feed into policy questions. We also want to see how these preferences, in fact, play a role in the different policies. So in particular, we want to evaluate some of the adoption policies that I just talked about, the ones that have to do with banning particular types of adoptive parents, like foreign parents or same-sex couples. Okay, so I'm now going to describe to you the general, very rough scheme of the adoption process. So in the adoption process, the main players are the birth mothers who are ready to relinquish their child for adoption, and the prospective adoptive parents. We fondly nickname them through their acronyms, BMO and PAPs, so sometimes you'll see that on the slides. I'll keep talking about birth mothers and adoptive parents. Now, when a birth mother decides to relinquish her child for adoption, she can create a connection with an adoption agency, or she can contact some social circle of hers and announce that she's willing to give up her child for adoption, for example, a religious organization. When prospective adoptive parents decide they want to adopt a child, they have different routes that they can pursue, but there are three main ones. So one of them is just to go through international adoption. That is a process in and of itself that has become very difficult after 2008, after this treaty was ratified. They can approach an attorney or an adoption agency directly and go in that route. So that kind of focuses on very particular agencies. Or they can work through a facilitator. So facilitators works very much like an intermediary between the agencies and the prospective adoptive parents. So if any of you have ever looked at a real estate online website, it looks very similar to that. You see the children that become available across time, and then the adoptive parents can apply after paying a certain fee to be able to access this information. Now, the birth mother, if she receives applications, she can decide to accept one of the applications. She can also decide to parent. And if all else fails and social services do not manage to find a home for the child with the family, then the child ends up in foster care. I should mention that foster care is associated with a bunch of bad things. So incarceration rates, homelessness, drug use, and so on are much higher with children who enter the foster care system. So this is important to think about when we talk about policies. What I'm going to focus on today is this segment of the chart. So basically, we're going to zoom in on one facilitator and monitor her like a hawk over a period of several years. So let me describe in a bit more detail what we do. So we looked at an online adoption facilitator over several years. So today, I'll tell you about data from 2004 to 2009. We're still collecting this data, so hopefully we'll have even more information as time goes by. It's going to be a story of 800 children who were relinquished for adoption. 119 of them were matched through the facilitator, whereas 500 were matched outside. And 670 prospective adoptive parents participated in that period in the process. So these are the individuals we're going to focus on. We have a lot of data on the children's attributes, the prospective adoptive parents' applications, and the final matches. So we are basically able to look at the entire process that they go through while they're on the site or while they're working with the facilitator. The timing is as follows. So the birth mothers can essentially restrict the types of parents that they're willing to consider for adoption. So that's their main decision to make. They can decide whether they're willing to accept applications from only straight couples, from same-sex couples, from foreign couples, single mothers, and so on and so forth. So that's their main decision to decide which types of parents they're willing to consider. The adoptive parents, the prospective adoptive parents, pay an initial fee of $4,800, and then they have access to all of the children that become available on the site. And then they can submit an application to whichever birth mothers they're interested in as her child becomes available. The applications are binding, and this is really important. So if you submit an application and your application gets accepted by the birth mothers, all other applications are automatically deleted, and if you do not follow through, you're out of the process. So this entails a fair bit of commitment on the side of the adoptive parents. The birth mothers have to ultimately also make a choice of what to do. So they get a bunch of applications. They have to decide which parents they want to give their child to, or they can decide to parent the child, or they just disappear from our data. That happened in some percentage of cases. So here's an example of a case. So the names are not the real names, but this is Brigitte, the birth mother. She was presented on January 15th, 2009, and the child was due in February 2026. The child was 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 Asian, and the gender was unknown. The estimated adoption finalization cost was $31,000 and $790, in addition to the fixed fee to the facilitator of $4,800. And the birth mother imposed a bunch of restrictions on the types of parents that she was willing to consider. So she was willing to consider single prospective adoptive parents, but she was not willing to consider same-sex or foreign adoptive parents. There were 8 applications by March 2nd, and she was matched on March 2nd. So here's a summary of all of the data that we have on the babies. Now, you don't need to kind of internalize this mass of numbers, but let me direct you to some things that are sort of important for what I'll tell you next. So 22% of our children are girls and 31% are boys. This doesn't sum up to 100%, I realize. And it's not that the rest have no gender. It's just that these women did not go through an ultrasound, or they don't know what the gender is. Most of the race distribution is between Caucasian, African American, and Hispanic. So 39% are African American, 36% are Caucasian, and less than 13% are Hispanics. Most of our children are before birth. So most of our children, about 73%, are before birth. And conditional on being born, they're very young. This is sort of interesting to keep in mind. They're about 1 month old. Now, the last thing that is sort of interesting to think about is the finalization cost. The finalization cost on average is $26,000. That's in addition to the $4,800 that these parents have to pay to the facilitator. And they have a huge variance. So they vary between $3,500 and $52,000. And this is a graph that just gives you a sense of the distribution of these costs. So then the x-axis, there is the cost, and the probability of each cost is on the y-axis. Okay, so all you can see is that there's sort of a peak around $26,000, and it's fairly wide. So this is sort of interesting. We observe the adoptive parents in first names and full behavior. So we see who they apply for and when they apply for these children. Our adoptive parents are all Caucasian, and we need to put a bit of effort in identifying what type of parents they are, so what class of parents they are. So for single adoptive parents are fairly easy because they have only one name, so this is easy for us. Name-based, gay adoptive parents are a bit trickier. Sometimes it's really easy. If it's John and Michael, it's easy. But if it's Kim and Lance or Joe and Jane, it's a bit trickier because these names are not necessarily indicative of what gender they are. So we need to go through some process of probabilistic deduction of how to classify them into the different categories. For foreigners, we use their behavior as a proxy for their likelihood of being foreign. So if we see adoptive parents who apply only for children who allow for foreign adoptive parents, we think they're more likely to be foreign. And likewise, if we see parents that apply for many kids that allow only for US adoptive parents, we think they're more likely to be US parents. Here's the summary statistics for the parents. Again, you needn't internalize all of this information, but just to give you some of the important highlights, there are about 6% gay adoptive parents, 6% lesbian parents, 8% single parents, and 52% foreign parents. Most of our data comes before the Hague Treaty, and that's why we see a lot of foreigners here. And they spend not too long of a time on this website. So they spend 103 days on average on site. So the whole process is sort of quick. Okay, how do we estimate preferences? We use a very simple model, and I'll just give you kind of the model on a shoestring, essentially, to give you a sense of the techniques we use. So we're thinking about a situation where there are two sides of the matching process. In our case, it's birth mothers and adoptive parents that search for a match. This could be relevant also for the marriage market, for example. You have two sides that sort of look for one another, and they randomly match at each period. They meet randomly, and they observe some attributes of one another. If they both decide this is an acceptable match, the other person is desirable, or the child is sufficiently appealing that you want to go forward with this, then they leave the process. They form a match, and they leave the process. Such a model has is essentially tantamount to both types of individuals, birth mothers and adoptive parents, or the different types of mates in the marriage market, solving an option value problem. So this will sound similar for those of you who look at the stock market. You essentially need to decide whether you want to stop right now or have the option value of waiting and potentially meeting someone who's even more appealing to you. The prediction that we have here in equilibrium, which is essentially a notion that corresponds to a situation where everyone is doing the best thing for themselves simultaneously, is that each participant will use what we call a reservation utility. So that means that each participant has some sort of threshold, such that if they meet a child that's sufficiently appealing, that kind of satisfies certain conditions for them, they apply for them. And likewise, the birth mothers, if they meet adoptive parents that seem sort of good enough above a certain threshold, they accept it. So this is sort of the underlying behavior that we'll observe from any such model. And this really helps us to tie the adoptive parents' and birth mothers' behavior to preferences. So this is what allows us to disentangle the supply and demand conundrum that we usually have. So this is really our challenge, kind of the fact that using aggregate data, we usually can't disentangle these two things. So I'm going to start telling you a bit about preferences over different attributes. So with respect to gender, we see a preference for girls. So the probability of receiving an application for a non-African American girls is 11.5%, as opposed to 7.9% for a non-African American boy. This translates into about $16,000 in terms of willingness to pay. This is sort of interesting because it's contrary to some evidence that suggests a preference for boys with biological children. This evidence is very indirect. So for example, you can look at the rate of divorce if the first child is a girl or if the first child is a boy. And as it turns out, the rate is slightly higher when the first child is a girl. Or you can look at the chances of remarrying if you have a girl or a boy, and so on and so forth. So there's some evidence for a tiny but still significant preference for boys as opposed to girls when you look at that. So it's sort of interesting that in the adoption context, we see the reverse. Now let's go back to the census. In the census, 53% of adopted children are girls, whereas if you look at the entire population in the US, 48% are girls. So there are more girls that are being adopted relative to the baseline in the population. So like I said before, this could be due to supply or to demand. But the preferences that we identify suggest that some demand effect is playing an important role in creating this wedge between what we see in the adopted population and the baseline population. With respect to race, we find even stronger preferences. What we see is that the probability of receiving an application from an African American baby of unknown gender is 1.7% relative to 13% of non-African American babies. And in terms of willingness to pay, this would translate roughly to $62,000. Looking at the census, we can do the same sort of exercise. So if you look at the census, you actually see more African American kids adopted relative to the baseline population. So about 16% of adopted kids are African American compared to only 14.8% of kids in the entire population. So what we see in the adoption market would suggest that there is a strong supply effect, that we might expect that there's simply more African American children that are put up for adoption. Now, one possible explanation when you see this, and we believe it certainly explains some of the data, is that there's something that sociologists call homophily that is playing a role here. So the idea that sociologists came up with is that people tend to connect with people who are similar to them. And we see that across the board. So people connect with people who look similar to them, who have similar political opinions, who have similar demographics, and so on and so forth. So it might be that since all of our adoptive parents are Caucasian, they simply want children that look like them. It's nothing about race. They just want a child that looks like them. However, recall that we have Hispanic children available for adoption as well. And as it turns out, there is very little difference between the desirability of Hispanic and Caucasian children in our data set. In fact, there is no significant difference between the application rates that both these types of children receive. So we would think that if everything was driven by wanting a child that looks like you, there would be some wedge between Hispanics and Caucasians, which we don't see. So we think there's something else that's going on here. You might also think that maybe it's not really about race or gender. It's just that race and gender are proxies for other stuff that people care about. So maybe there's a reason why they have this preference. If you thought that girls are taken care of better than boys, then this would be a good reason to focus on girls. Or if you thought that for some reason certain races were more prone to neglecting their health care, then this would be, again, a good reason to kind of differentiate between them. So we collected auxiliary data on 125 birth mothers that included their age, their medical history, their education, their criminal record, alcohol use, and so on. And what we saw is that actually cases corresponding to boys and girls did not differ at all in a statistical manner. And if anything, African American birth mothers had nicer markers than non-African American mothers. So this doesn't seem to explain things. In fact, I won't go through this in detail, but I'll just leave this here in case you want to stare at it. What you see here in this column corresponds to kids who have more than 50% African American blood in them. Here there are kids with less than 50%. Here you see boys, girls, and unknown gender, and the different categories of the mothers. And serious health problems are serious. So this is cancer, diabetes, and so on. Serious drug use, again, it's serious drugs. It's meth, heroin, and so on. So if you look at it, you'll see that there isn't really a great difference between the columns, just eyeballing it. There is another concern of selection, which is that it might be that we pick this weird facilitator that gets all these wacky parents who have these weird preferences. So it might be that we're just looking at very particular parents here. But as it turns out, when you look at the type of kids that we get, girls represent 54% of adopted children in the general population, while only 49% of our matched cases are girls. So if anything, adoptive parents who enter the process are facing a lower likelihood of achieving a girl than in the entire population. This is even starker with respect to African Americans, because African Americans represent 6.4% of children adopted by Caucasian households, according to the census, but they represent 24% of our matched cases. So if anything, when you enter this website, if anything, you should be more open to adopting an African American child. The last type of preference that I want to tell you about is that having to do with the time to and from birth. And what we find is that unborn babies become more desirable as the due date approaches. Now, this is sort of interesting because there are two countervailing effects for what would drive your preference with respect to the time to birth. On the one hand, if you match early, you can really monitor the mother. There are all these Hollywood-like stories in which parents actually take into their homes the mother and attend to her health care and feed her and so on and so forth. So you can really make sure that the mother takes care of herself very well. This is the kind of pro to matching early. However, there's far less commitment. So for all this time in the gestation process, you're bound to some sort of risk because you're spending all this financial resources and emotional resources and connecting to this mother, while she can't really commit. She can break the commitment at any point till the child is born. And so what we see suggests that the second effect is stronger than the first one. So this commitment effect might be more important to parents than the first one. Once the baby is born, their desirability drops pretty much instantly. So this is sort of interesting given that the babies in our data set are very young. So conditional on being born, they're about 1 month old. So it's not that we're talking about several years old children. And in fact, this is sort of the figure that corresponds to the desirability. So what you see on the x-axis is the month from birth, and on the y-axis, the probability of getting an application. And what you see is that there's sort of a decline around 0. So it's an increasing curve that declines around 0. With respect to the different types of parents, so I told you that we managed to classify the parents according to whether they're single parents or same-sex couples or foreign parents. And what we see is that overall, the probability of submitting an application is highest for gay and lesbian couples. However, interestingly, the reported biases that I just told you about are magnified for same-sex couples. So in fact, lesbian couples have the highest bias in favor of girls and gay men the second highest. And the probability of applying for an African-American baby is essentially 0 for same-sex couples and single mothers. And the application drop at birth is largest for single mothers and same-sex couples as well. Foreign adoptive parents have the lowest biases. So this will be really important when we start thinking about policies. But before that, if we think just about outcomes, just very briefly, what we observe that matters a lot for whether a child will be matched or not is the finalization cost. And this I'm actually putting up as sort of a puzzle. We still don't fully understand the mechanism by which this happens. But what we observe is these sorts of figures. There's no need to, they're really cool, I think, but there's no need to kind of focus on the particular details. What's important is to note that for high finalization cost, there is a higher rate of matching. The left panel corresponds to matching through our facilitator, and the right panel corresponds to matching anywhere. Okay, so what's sort of curious to us is the fact that higher finalization costs correspond to higher matching rates. Okay, let me go into the last part of this talk, which has to do with policy implications. So we had two policy questions that we were interested in. One had to do with the ban of same-sex couples, and one that had to do with the ban of foreign couples, since these are really the policy debates that we see right now. So I'm going to use kind of over-the-envelope types of calculations to give you a sense of the effects of these sorts of policy changes. So in our data set, only 18% of birth mothers accept applications from same-sex adoptive parents. So we can ask how many matches would be destroyed if same-sex couples were banned from the adoptive parents' population. So basically, we would look at birth mothers who receive applications only from same-sex adoptive parents. Because if we took them away, these birth mothers would not receive any applications. And what we get is that there would be 6% less matches. Now, 6% may look like a small number to you, but remember that it's out of the 18% that allow for same-sex applications. We can do the same sort of exercise with foreign parents. So 78% of our birth mothers accept applications from foreign adoptive parents. So we can again ask how many matches would be severed if we didn't allow for foreign parents. So again, we look at birth mothers who receive applications only from foreign parents, and what we see is that about 33% of the matches would be severed if we banned foreigners from our process. So to conclude, what I tried to show you is a new data set, kind of tell you a story of a new data set that allows us to estimate preferences over children's attributes and evaluate some of the policies that are considered nowadays. And with respect to preferences, what we saw is that girls are preferred to boys, Caucasian and Hispanic children are preferred to African American children, and child desirability has a very particular pattern with respect to the time to birth. So it increases as you get closer and closer to the time of birth, but it sort of drops as the child is born, which is very important to make sure that kind of the adoption process works well and is not disrupted before the child is being born. Banning different classes of parents, same-sex or foreign, significantly reduces the number of successful adoptions that we see here. Now, before I end, I'd like to leave you with some food for thought. So the first element has to do with alternative ways to match people. Or match these adoptive parents with the children. So you can think about different ways to do that. You can go more centralized, as is done in some European countries. So in fact, in some European countries, it's a judge that acts as sort of a clearinghouse. They receive applications from parents, they receive information about new babies that become available, and they match them in some sort of stroke of magic. Or you can think about more free-form ways. So in fact, Landis and Richard Posner, who's a famous legal scholar, suggested in 1978 the opening of a market for adoption. And in fact, some argued that this cost Richard Posner the price of becoming a Supreme Court justice. So this was very controversial, this idea. And this sort of controversy leads me to the second and last question that I want to leave you with, which is, which markets should we intervene in? So should we intervene in labor markets? That seems sort of fine, and we've already done that. Kidney exchanges, we've already done that as well. In fact, we keep doing that. School allocations, kids, other organs. What are repugnant markets? So that's all, folks. Thank you very much.